Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. My colleague Laura is going to let people in if they continue coming in after we get started. But welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Joy Warland, and I'm the consultant for continuing education and small and rural libraries at the Department of Libraries. Today's workshop is Disaster Planning for Vermont Libraries. This is the beginner workshop. It's part of a two-series workshop. There's another one a week from today, same time, an intermediate workshop. And both of these workshops are presented in collaboration with the Vermont Historical Records Program and the Vermont Arts and Culture Disaster and Resilience Network. So today we have a guest presenter, Roving Archivist Sally Blanchard-O'Brien, and she's going to do a presentation. We'll have time for Q&A at the end. Just a few things before she gets started, though. If you can all turn off your mics and cameras when you're not speaking or asking a question. We are recording this, and the recordings look very strange if multiple people have cameras on. So if you get to the Q&A part, you can unmute yourself and ask a question. There's also a hand raising feature in Teams. If you just hover over, we'll see that your hand is raised and we'll call on you. And you can also type in the chat. I'm not sure if we have anyone calling in, but if anyone's on the phone and you want to unmute yourself, you can unmute yourself with pushing *6. So again, we'll have Q&A at the end, but also use the chat anytime. I'll be monitoring it while Sally's presenting. And if there's anything that seems important to ask her in real time, we will do that. And with that, I will stop talking and welcome Sally. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Joy. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. So I'm pleased to be here today to talk to you about disaster planning, though it may not be the happiest of topics. As Joy said, this is a workshop for beginners, so I'll be presenting some basic and introductory information. Though, as also Joy mentioned, my colleague Rachel Onif will be presenting the intermediate level workshop this same time next week. So my presentation will last a little under an hour. We'll have a little bit of time at the end for questions. And before we get started, just a little bit more about myself. I'm Sally Blanchard-O'Brien, Roving Archivist for the Vermont Historical Records Program at the Secretary of State's office within the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration. So I've been working there and with the state for almost 9 years. And I've been working with the Vermont Historical Records Program since late 2019. So I'm also a steering committee member for the Vermont Arts and Culture Disaster and Resilience Network. So what are these two organizations that I represent? The Vermont Historical Records Program, or VHRP, serves to improve public access to and engagement with Vermont historical records and to encourage and facilitate collaboration among Vermont historical records repositories. We can conduct on-site assessments, provide guidance and assistance, help connect organizations that want to collaborate on initiatives, and teach workshops like this one. The Vermont Arts and Culture Disaster and Resilience Network, or VACDaRN, which is a lot easier to say, is a partnership of the Vermont Arts Council, the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration, and the Vermont Emergency Management Association. So through this network, we enable arts organizations, and cultural heritage institutions to share their resources, their experiences and expertise. We help mobilize response for mutual assistance during emergencies, and we engage the cultural heritage and arts sector with first responders and government emergency management agencies. So both organizations can be of assistance to you, so don't hesitate to reach out after this webinar. VACDaRN in particular has really helpful resources for emergency preparedness on our website, which I will look at briefly towards the end of this presentation. So I know this slide is probably stating the obvious, but it's important to come back sometimes to the why. Why is disaster planning so important? Why did you take the time to be here today? Because it is so easy for disaster planning to become a low priority. Disaster planning is spending time preparing for and learning about what you hope you'll never have to use. But that's just the problem, isn't it? You don't know how essential this is until an emergency has already happened and it's effectively too late. You want to be prepared enough that when the unexpected happens, you can have the best possible outcome. Disaster planning can help alleviate chaos when something is happening by providing a structure to follow. It tells you what to do and how, helping those feelings of paralysis and panic when an emergency arises. You have the steps you need right in front of you. The steps the disaster plan provides helps protect the safety of people and property by giving a logical order to things. So it tells you, like, entering a building only after it's been stabilized. The disaster plan can help facilitate a quicker return to normal operations and reduce losses by ensuring that your most essential records and items are saved first. And if your community and if your organization is actually very prepared, it can actually help the resiliency of the entire community. So libraries are community spaces, and if your library bounces back quickly, then your space and staff can help out others in need in the community. And we've all witnessed that disasters are occurring with more frequency. Don't fall into the trap of it can't happen here or it won't happen to us because you just don't know. Tropical Storm Irene was 10 years ago, but the consequences of that storm are still vivid in our living memories. We prepare now so we can bounce back more quickly the next time a storm or some other disaster happens. So I'd like to quickly show you what I'll be covering today. We'll begin with a brief overview of emergency management, just so you can have the basics in mind as we continue along. Then we'll get into the heart of today's topic, and I'll show you how to develop a disaster plan. Then we'll discuss how to implement your plan and tips and strategies for getting it done. And finally, I'll share some resources that you can take with you and use to start your own disaster planning process. So before we get into the nuts and bolts about actually creating a disaster plan, I have a quick and dirty beginner's guide to emergency management. It's important to understand a bit about how emergency management works and how disaster planning fits into the bigger picture. When people think of disasters, they typically only think of a few types, but as you can see from this list, there are probably some that you haven't thought of. However, I think this past year has been a crash course in disaster awareness, as we've seen several of these over the past few months in the US, including flooding, fires, cyber attacks, terrorism, and the one on everyone's mind, pandemic. Emergencies and disasters generally fall under 3 different categories. So natural disasters, disasters caused by human hands, and this can be accidental or intentional. And the third category is what's considered everyday disasters, but these are often caused by natural and man-made disasters as well, such as a power outage after a storm, or a structural fire after a lightning strike, or maybe an act of arson. I want to share with you the hazards that rank highest for Vermont, as determined by the State Hazard Mitigation Plan from 2018. So to no one's surprise, probably, the biggest hazards involve flooding, but it's interesting to see how low infectious disease outbreak ranked on their plan just 2 short years before the COVID pandemic. So the state updates its hazard mitigation plan every 5 years, and this table might look a little different at the next assessment. And as you can see, this table only includes natural disasters, but given the major cyber attack that happened on the UVM hospital system this past year, it's interesting. It'd be interesting to note how the state might include man-made disasters into their next plan. So there are 4 basic phases to the emergency management cycle, and these phases take place before, during, and after an emergency. So you've already had a little taste of the mitigation phase in the last slide. The mitigation phase are actions that are undertaken to eliminate threats or hazards, or at least to minimize the impact of them. It requires looking at the risks that your institution faces, or in the case of the previous slide, the risks that the state faces, understanding where you're vulnerable, and then taking steps to address those risks. So if you know that your library is in a floodplain, for example, you might mitigate the impact of flooding damage by moving stacks located in a basement level to a higher floor. The way to understand your risks is to undertake a risk assessment, which you saw an example of in the State Hazard Mitigation Plan. So I won't be talking about risk assessment today because it is a big topic, but Rachel will be discussing it in her intermediate disaster preparedness training next week. And while the mitigation phase prevents future emergencies or ensures that their impact is lessened, the preparedness phase ensures that you are actually able to respond and recover from an emergency should it actually happen. So these are all the actions taken to ready yourself in case a disaster arises. So this is where the disaster plan comes in. So you are already taking your first step to prepare just by being here today. The response phase is what happens during an actual emergency. So these are the in-the-moment, immediate, and short-term steps you must take to react when a disaster happens. So these are the steps such as calling first responders, notifying the first most appropriate staff member, or evacuation of the building. This is the phase where steps are taken to ensure the safety of people and property, and is when your preparedness plan gets called into action. And the recovery phase is what happens after the emergency is over, and is the process by which operations are brought back to normal, or at least to the extent that that's possible. So this phase can take days, weeks, or months, depending on the severity of the disaster. This is the cleanup, the time when insurance claims are filed and other financial avenues are explored, and when collections are treated for damage. And what is learned through the recovery phase can inform what needs to be done to further mitigate potential emergencies. So to use my earlier example, if some of the library's collection is lost in a flood because it was stored in the basement level, you would then know that any remaining items should probably be moved to a higher location to prevent flood damage in the future. So once you've moved those items, you have mitigated the risk of future flood damage to your collection. So emergency management phases really are an iterative practice that feed into each other and that need to be revisited from time to time. And emergency management is kind of notorious for using acronyms and other terminology that can be confusing to those who aren't a part of that field. So in order to best understand what's happening and advocate for yourself in the event of a disaster, it's important to be able to speak the language and use the terms the way emergency managers do. So there's many terms, but here are a few basic terms that can be useful when interacting with the world of emergency management. So an incident is an event, accidentally or deliberately caused, that requires a response. And disasters and emergencies are types of incidents. So an emergency is a serious and unexpected, often dangerous, situation requiring immediate action. Emergencies are often localized, while disaster is large scale or widespread, resulting in significant loss or damage. Or the way the Conservation Center of Philadelphia puts it, a disaster is an emergency that has gotten out of control. A hazard is a natural, technological, or social phenomenon that poses a threat. So you deal with hazards by performing a risk assessment, as I mentioned earlier. That's the process of identifying the likelihood and the potential impact of a threat. The Emergency Operations Center, or EOC, is the physical location where a coordination of resources and information takes place during a disaster response. Often, this is a temporary location off-site. The Incident Command System, or ICS, is the model by which disaster response often runs and the way the emergency operations centers operate. So the ICS is a hierarchical structure that ensures who reports to who and keeps efforts streamlined and organized, and that helps to reduce chaos, ensure the efficient use of resources, and keeps everyone involved safe. And finally, the damage assessment, different from the risk assessment, is the process of identifying and documenting the extent of physical damage a disaster has caused to buildings, collections, and other property. So this only happens after it's been deemed safe to enter the affected spaces, which allows recovery to begin. And now we are going to move on to the heart of today's subject matter. So how to develop a disaster plan. So I'm going to walk through the basic components of the plan and then show you some examples along the way. But before you jump in, you ideally want to gather a team to get through the process of creating your disaster plan. Having a team helps delegate responsibility and keeps everyone accountable and on task. And also, before you begin, you'd ideally want to have the support of your library's director or board of trustees. This should be secured as the first part of the planning process to make sure that you're going to have the buy-in and that it's seen as an institutional priority project. So when selecting a team, you're going to want to include employees, volunteers, or any other library support that you have in areas that represent different functions for your library. So this way you have representation from all areas and all necessary knowledge. So as a librarian, you may not know important information about water shutoff valves or something like that, for example, but the person who manages your building would know. And so you'd want that person at the table while you're planning. So you'd want to try to include such people as someone who knows about the administration of the library, including the important operational records, staff who deals with collections and know what items might be rare or irreplaceable, especially if the library has rare books or a local history room. You'd like the person who knows about important networking and technology requirements, whomever is responsible for building safety or security, facility or building manager has a good understanding of the layout of the building and all of its systems and shutoffs. And finally, someone who has the power to make purchases and or enter into contracts for the library. Librarians wear many, many hats, as I'm sure you're all aware, and it is quite possible that one person fills many of these roles, but that's okay. The importance of having the team is to make sure that all areas of knowledge are reflected in the plan and that one person doesn't have to take on this important work alone. So the team is also instrumental in distributing and maintaining the plan, which is something I'll talk about a little bit later. And as you'll see in some later slides, there are sections of your plan that can be quite extensive or that will require a lot of information gathering. But don't let it feel overwhelming. Just do what you need to do to get it done. So some suggestions I have for you are to break sections into smaller chunks, delegate responsibility for information gathering or the completion of different sections of the plan, and you have a team by your side to help you with this work. Definitely set deadlines, that'll keep you on track, and hold each other accountable. Keep checking in with your team, have regular meetings. You don't have to do all of this in one day, but it's important to keep working at it and just keep making sustained progress. So it's okay to be a tortoise. Slow and steady wins the race, as they say. And if you are consistently working at the plan, you begin to make emergency preparedness sustained in your thinking. And if you're thinking about it constantly, consistently, it can become a sustained effort for your library. So there is good news and bad news about disaster planning. The bad news is it does take time and effort, as you can see. But the good news is you do not have to start from scratch. So there are lots and lots of templates out there that are available to use that are a great start and jumping off point. And I'll show you a few of these in the resource section at the end. When I get to that point and on your own time, take a look at them all and see what works best for your institution. But the Vermont Historical Records Program has created a basic disaster plan template for Vermont, and that is the basic plan structure that I'll walk you through today. So this template is available on the VACDaRN website, and it's a Microsoft Word document, so you can fill it out with your own information pretty easily. And you should have received it as a handout for this presentation, but if for some reason you didn't, I'll give you the link at the end, or you can ask me later. So the template arranges all parts of the plan into 5 basic categories. So first is the contact list, or who needs to be called in when a disaster happens. Next are the response procedures. This is the section that describes where, when, and how you respond to a situation. Then you have your institution's salvage priorities. What is the stuff that's crucial to save and must be saved before anything else? You'll want to include an inventory of supplies and their locations to help you implement any of your response procedures. And finally, you'll want to include an emergency record. And this emergency record is your why. Why disaster planning is necessary, because you have evidence of what's happened before. So I'm now going to go through each of these in more detail and then show you some examples. I do have with me today the very official disaster plan of the Hogwarts Library, so you can see some pieces of the disaster plan template filled out. So the contact list is the part of the plan that you see first. It tells you exactly who to contact and when. So if you walk into your building and you see something has happened, you can open your plan, and the first thing you do is know who to call to get the response efforts going. So the contact section can include emergency contacts, such as local fire and police, and then lists the people that should be called. This section is a phone tree, which really tells you the order in which people should be called or the circumstances in which they should be called. So if it's a water emergency versus a theft versus a fire, for example. So here is an example from the Hogwarts Library disaster plan. So first, if there's a fire or injury, easy, just call 911. That's what you do first, your first contact. But then, who is the first person you call after emergency responders? So in this case, Professor McGonagall is the Hogwarts Library disaster team leader, so she would be called in first. Then the next person to be called would be dependent on the type of emergency. So is it flooding or building damage? Hagrid, the groundskeeper, would be called in those cases. If there's a problem with electrical systems, then they would call their electrician from Lumos Light Technicians. So you can see from this example that in some situations, you would call internal staff. Sometimes you would call external service providers. It all depends on who has the responsibility for that which is affected. And oftentimes, disasters are going to affect several things at once. So is there flooding as well as damage to collections? Then you would call Hagrid for the water issues, as well as Madam Pince, the librarian, to deal with the collection damage. So in any given situation, you're calling multiple people to handle different aspects of the damage, both people internal to the institution and externally. And the template first gives you some very important notes. So you must protect lives before property and assess personal safety before acting. So that's the first thing that should always be done in an emergency. If there are power lines down in front of the library entrance, for example, do not go inside to assess the damage. Keep everyone safe above everything else. This note is placed first in the template, so you see it first thing as a reminder in the moment when you need it. So while you are creating your contact list, ask yourself some questions. Who on your staff would need to be notified during a disaster? Who would need to be involved in a disaster response? In what order should they be notified? And also look at who has the responsibility for what within your institution. This will help you determine who needs to be notified during a disaster. Who handles the collection? Who handles building issues? Who handles computer and IT stuff? Do you have utilities or contracts externally who handle these issues for you? These are the people who need to be contacted during a disaster. And be aware of what local emergency services are available and add them to the contact list. But as we discussed, the number for them would be 911 if there was an immediate active emergency, such as a fire or a medical problem. So next, we have the guidelines for how to respond during an incident. So these response procedures tell you what to do during an emergency as it's happening. This includes procedures for evacuation and other emergencies, floor plans that include the locations of shutoffs for water or other building systems, information about your insurance and your utility providers, technology backups and passwords, contact information for local emergency management offices, and locations of sites that could be used for temporary operations or salvage recovery. This is all the stuff that gets you through the moment and helps you set up for the recovery phase. So in our examples here, we have a brief description of how an evacuation should proceed. So in this case, if time allows, secure essential records and shut down electrical equipment, proceed to nearest exit, shut all doors as you leave, assist disabled employees and visitors in exiting, do not use the moving staircases, do not open doors if warm or smoke is present. Once outside, assemble at the designated area. And you can see the plan has established that assembly area and a backup assembly area to gather and after the evacuation. The Hogwarts Library has established an agreement with the manager of Platform 9 3/4 to have a temporary staging area or a command center in case the entire castle is compromised and there's no space available within the Hogwarts building itself. So this could be a place to command operations for cleanup, to spread out and salvage books if they've been wet or damaged. Platform 9 3/4 is actually a little far away from Hogwarts to really be useful. Ideally, you would want to have an agreement with someone in your community. So perhaps a school with a gym, a municipal office building, a civic center. Finding a location with a large space to spread out in would be ideal. And in the second example, on the right-hand side, you can see the template lists several Vermont contacts that can help in an emergency. So that's including Vermont Emergency Management, VACDaRN, the Secretary of State, and Vermont's regional office with FEMA. So this is a place to put the contact information of your local emergency management director and regional planning commission as well. Contact information for your utility providers can be captured here, as well as information about your insurance agents or providers. These are the people who are key in your recovery, but that should be contacted after your key contacts who are identified in that first section. And here you have an example of floor plans that are labeled with locations of important building systems equipment, such as water tanks, furnaces. And it's important to note any special circumstances on the floor plans. So the Hogwarts Library restricted section is located on the second floor of the library, so that's normally kept locked. And that piece of information would be important to know in an emergency, so that you might need to get a key to get into that space. There's also a list of locations of fire extinguishers, fire alarm pull boxes, and utility switch-offs. And photos that are included show very clearly where the shutoffs are. All this information is very important during the chaos of an immediate disaster. Again, it's designed to help you right in the moment. You or your emergency responders can quickly look at the floor plan and see where to go, only if it's safe to enter the space, of course. But it shows you what you're looking for to quickly shut off anything that needs to be to stop further damage. And I didn't include an example of the technology piece, but that would go in the response procedure section as well. So this would be where you capture necessary passwords and the location of any computer backups that would enable you to access your technology and your data, especially if you have to set up your computer equipment in a temporary off-site location. So it's important to capture that there. And here are some questions to ask yourself as you fill out this section of the plan. So what are your procedures for evacuating the building or handling a medical emergency or some other type of situation? Where are the locations of shutoffs for building system equipment like water and electric? Map those locations on a floor plan of your library. Who are the vendors and contractors you use, and who are your insurance and utility providers that would need to be contacted to begin the recovery process of filing damage claims or fixing damage? Where do you store your computer backups, and what are the passwords to get into your data so you can access your IT? And where in your community could you set up a temporary space for emergency operations and recovery if you needed to? Start talking to those places and agree to it. The Vermont Department of Buildings and General Services, or VGS, they have a flip chart of procedures for various emergency situations that you might want to take a look at when developing this section. These procedures go beyond just building evacuations and medical emergencies, and they discuss what to do during all different types of scenarios, such as suspicious packages, hazardous spills, all kinds of things. There's a lot here, but it's definitely something to consider when you're working on your own response procedures. So next up in our disaster plan is a list of salvage priorities. So this is the stuff that is most important to be saved, that needs to be saved first before anything else. So it includes operational records, those records you absolutely need to keep doing business, catalogs and other records about your collections that without you wouldn't know what you have. These operational and collections records is your absolutely essential stuff. And other salvage priorities might be actual priorities within your collection. So this is much more common for archives and museums, but if you do have a rare book room or a local history room in your library, that's the stuff that's irreplaceable that you would want to save before anything in your general circulating collection. So with these salvage priorities, you want to include the location of these items right in your plan. And by listing the priorities and where they're stored, it's all in one convenient place for that time when it's been deemed safe to enter the building, and then you can begin to pull out what needs to be saved first. Here is an example from our sample plan. So in this situation, the Hogwarts library has some special object collections that would need to be prioritized over the general circulating book collections. So this is the rare stuff. Library staff have gone through and marked with colored tags that indicate whether something is a high priority or a medium priority. For stuff on shelves, you could use reflective tape or colored flags. Again, flagging priorities is going to be incredibly useful when you have many hands and volunteers going into the space. It's a really simple system and everyone knows what to look for quickly. So the library here has also indicated which of their collections records are important to save and their administrative records that they would need to continue to operate. So each set of records has a description of where in the building that they're located and what they look like. And here's another set of questions to ask yourself while creating this section. So what administrative records would you absolutely need to continue operating your library? What catalogs and other bibliographic records do you have about your collection? And do you have any valuable or irreplaceable materials like local history collection? And that stuff would need to be prioritized over the general circulating collection. And once you know what the salvage priorities are, where are they located? And should you indicate or tag the items in some way to show that they are a priority? So determining priorities can take time, but it's really essential to being able to bounce back after an emergency because it ensures that you can keep operating, that you have information about your holdings, and that the irreplaceable stuff is protected and preserved for the future. So now we're moving into the section where we record what supplies we have on hand to help in responding to an emergency situation. So disasters can be, and often are, very messy, and having some essential supplies can help protect you and your space during the cleanup, as well as helping to triage any damage to your collections. So you'll want to include an inventory of the supplies that you have, where they're stored, and ideally, you might want to include stores or other places where you can buy more of those supplies if needed. This is a blank example from the disaster plan template that lists types of supplies that are good to have on hand. So you'll see personal protective equipment like masks and gloves, collection salvage supplies like boxes and blotter paper, and cleanup equipment like fans, buckets, mops. Record-keeping supplies like paper and cameras are very useful in documenting damage to your building and collections, so that's very important for insurance purposes, among other reasons. So the template allows you to record how much you have of each supply and where it's stored. And as mentioned before, you might want to indicate where you can get more supplies, especially if it's something that's not super easy to find at just a regular drugstore or grocery store. Keep your inventory updated. You'll want to check the supply cache from time to time and note when it was last checked. So this is a really good tip. Try keeping your supplies together in a bin or a bucket to consolidate things and just make it really easy to grab in one go when you need it. And something plastic like a bin or a bucket is ideal. So it's water resistant, it's not going to rust or it's not going to disintegrate like a cardboard box would be. And to recap the supply inventory, determine what supplies you already have on hand and where they are stored, and then ask yourself what supplies you want to get and where you can get them. Now we are moving on to the final section of the disaster plan, the record or the history of previous emergencies or disasters that your institution has faced. So what's happened in the past will tell you what's possible, and it might indicate what might be likely to happen again. So this section will require a little bit of research, and you can do that by asking longtime or former employees or volunteers to search through their own memories of past incidents. You might want to check the floodplains for your region and see if your institutional building is located on a floodplain, because that might indicate previous flooding incidents. And if your administrative records have any past insurance claims, you can look at those to see what happened to initiate those claims. So in our example, the Hogwarts library briefly describes 2 past incidents: an attempted break into the restricted section and a haywire raining hex caused by a second-year study group that caused water damage to a small section of the collection. So you probably want your description of past events to be a little bit more detailed than in our example, but importantly, you want to include what happened, when, what was affected, what resources you needed for recovery, and that can include the money, the time, the personnel, and any vendors that you worked with. And it's quite possible you might not be able to reconstruct what happened in the past, and if that's the case, that's okay. Then you'll just keep this space for anything that happens in the future, and be sure to write down whatever happens during any emergencies going forward. So now we've walked through each component of the plan. So together, all the pieces give you the instructions for what to do when the unexpected happens. So by going through this process of planning, you'll know who to call, what to prioritize, and what to do when the time comes. And your disaster plan might not look exactly like the examples I showed you here, and it may not follow exactly the templates that I'll share with you later, but that's okay, because your plan is unique to your institution and you need it to work for you and your specific needs. So you finished your plan. Congratulations. Now what? While writing a disaster plan is a very laudable achievement in itself, it's not enough just to have the plan and then hope you don't have to use it. You have to make sure that people know about it, that they know what to do with it, and that the information within it is accurate and up to date. So here are a few post-plan writing steps that you should implement to make sure that your library is prepared for when a disaster strikes. So first, you need to make sure that the plan is accessible to your staff and your volunteers. Distribute copies to your team members and all other essential staff members who have a role to play when a disaster happens. And you'll need to think about where to store the plan. So hard copies are great in different locations, also maybe somewhere in the cloud. The key to having the plan is that it's accessible and that people will be able to get to it when it's needed. So if the only copy of the plan is stored on a computer drive that crashes, or it's in a 3-ring binder on site when the building's on fire, the plan's not going to do much good. Having multiple copies is really key. So there's the old saying, lots of copies keep stuff safe. You want to have backup copies. And many people keep copies of their disaster plan in their car, so it's on the go with them. And really, ideally, a printed version is best, so it's not reliant upon electricity or the internet if those go out. And another good rule to remember is the 3-2-1 rule from digital preservation. So have 3 copies on at least 2 different kinds of media and 1 copy stored somewhere different than the other copies. The other thing that is important to remember is that the plan contains sensitive information about your building and institution. Private phone numbers, passwords, floor plans, insurance information. This is information that should not be made public. So this is really an internal document, not something to be published widely on your website for everyone to see. The details in the plan, if in the wrong hands, could make you vulnerable to theft or vandalism. Just remember to have multiple copies for everyone who needs the plan and keep it away from the eyes of everyone else. Or you can have and maintain 2 different versions. The full plan for only the handful of people who actually need it, and then a redacted version that can be shared more widely. And the plan does not really do any good if staff and volunteers are unaware of it, or if they don't know how to implement it when the time comes. So the best way to ensure good response when needed is to keep the plan in people's minds. So promote it. Keep raising awareness. Here are just a few ideas for promoting the plan and emergency preparedness in general. Try announcing it in a newsletter, sending out periodic emails to people who need it, discuss it periodically at meetings, schedule semi-regular training activities, such as some of the suggestions here. Make sure each person knows what their role entails. And you can practice evacuation drills, learn how to use a fire extinguisher. You can do tabletop exercises. These can be really useful, and they're theoretical scenarios where you run through your plan together to see how it would play out. And you do not have to do the training all by yourself. There are external organizations that can help you with some of these bigger items. So try asking your local fire department for fire extinguisher training. An organization like your local emergency management department could help with tabletop exercises or running drills. The Library of Congress has tabletop planning scenarios on their website. Promotion and training, again, take time and effort, just like drafting the plan, but it's worth the investment. Every time your staff and your volunteers are exposed to these skills and information, it will help them to retain it and will help reinforce proper timely action when it's needed. And it's crucial to remember that disaster plans are living documents and regularly need to be updated. Contact information changes. Building systems and computers get updated. So the information in your plan has to be up to date, or else it's not going to be useful to you. So establish a schedule of when you'll review the plan. Every year, every 2 years, typically annually is recommended. And at that time of review, read through the plan, check all the information, especially contact information and the supply inventory. Update if needed, and then once updates have been completed, immediately distribute to everyone who has and needs a copy of the plan so that everyone is literally on the same page, working from the same information. So I have a few tips, tricks, and strategies for helping you with emergency preparedness generally, outside the margins and bounds of the paper that your plan is written on. So these are some ways that you can get ahead of a disaster in addition to writing your plan, and that, and when the time comes, will help you to enact your disaster plan. One of the most important things you can do is to preemptively build relationships with your local emergency responders. This is really huge. It goes a long way to ensuring that they know who you are, what you do, what your needs are, and what your contributions are to the community. Libraries, archives, and other cultural heritage institutions are often left out of the conversations with other organizations' emergency preparedness efforts. So it is a good idea to put yourself out there and make those connections early before a disaster happens. If local emergency responders understand your building and needs, then they will be able to better respond when the time comes, and a better response will then help protect your building, collections, and other property. And an easy way to start the conversation with emergency responders is to have fire or police do a walkthrough of your building. Show them your floor plans, locations of important building equipment. This can help their response when an emergency arises. And some other ideas for how to connect with them is just to invite them to an event at your institution, or ask them for help with site assessment, or even emergency planning itself. Asking them to participate in any disaster plan training you might be doing with your staff or volunteers, or ask them to help run a tabletop exercise. Or you can even do the good neighborly deed and bring lunch or cookies over to the station. Basically, any way that you can introduce yourself and get your institution in their awareness. And there are some things that emergency responders should know to help them understand the importance of your library to the community. They should know that libraries can hold collective memory and culture for the community, and that your collections can be irreplaceable if lost, particularly if you have rare books or local history collection. But it's also important for them to know that the library can give back and be a helpful part of the recovery process after a disaster by being an information center or serving as a community gathering place. And of course, they need to know and have a general understanding of your layout, the locations of those building systems and shutoffs, etc. And this is the kind of information that you can share with them if you invite them for a walkthrough of your building. And don't forget, staff does turn over. So you'll want to keep up the relationship, which means, much like how you need to revisit and update your plan, you need to keep revisiting the connection that you have with your local emergency responders so that all current staff are aware of you and your needs. Another good idea to further your emergency preparedness is to set up a standing contract with vendors before disaster happens, kind of like having the agreement with another community organization to have a temporary space if needed. So having a standing contract will help communicate your needs and set expectations for both parties before a disaster strikes. So in the moment, you know what to expect and what services you'll receive. It also saves you a lot of time during an incident. So instead of having to take the time to find a vendor for what you need and calling to see if they're available to assist, in the moment, you'll already know who to call and they'll respond because you've already established that contract. And so here's some more good news. The state of Vermont already has a standing contract with Polygon, which is a full-service disaster recovery company based out of Massachusetts. So Polygon will respond to a disaster scene within 24 hours of being contacted by a state agency, cultural heritage institution, or municipal records holding entity. And they will provide guidance. They can help pack out and, if necessary, freeze and dry any affected materials. They can provide freezer trucks, packing supplies, other equipment as needed, as well as some of their own personnel to help assist, and they can help restore the affected space by drying, carpet cleaning, water extraction, etc. So the state contract means that those who use it, they're charged the special rate that the state negotiated, but the state does not pay for the service. That payment is up to you. So when looking into vendor services, it is really good to first be familiar with your insurance policy and to understand what it will cover. And remember section 4 of the plan, where we talked about supplies to have on hand. Here's a recap of some supplies that you can have that will help you in an emergency. Think about stuff like cleaning supplies, personal protective equipment, materials to help with drying, like a fan, absorbent paper. If the power's out, you'll want to have flashlights on hand. And again, camera and paper will help you document any damage. But what you want to do, ideally, is build your supply kits ahead of time. You can start to gather supplies while you're undertaking the disaster plan process, and it will be another way that you're prepared when the time comes. And remember to document what supplies you have, where they're stored, and where you can get more if needed, all in your disaster plan. And as promised, I want to move on to some resources that can help you through not only writing your disaster plan, but that can help you through your general emergency preparedness efforts. There are so many resources out there, and this is absolutely just the tip of the iceberg, but these are the resources that I think will be most immediately useful to you. So first, we have DPlan, which is the free online disaster planning tool where you can enter information about your institution into the fill-in-the-blank template. So this template helps guide you through the steps, and once complete, will generate a printable disaster plan specific to your institution. And as you know, since we learned today, disaster plans need to be continually reviewed and updated. DPlan allows you to update the information that you've already entered so your plan can be up to date. So you don't have to start filling in your information right away. There is actually a demo on the website that you can just check out. And DPlan was created by the Northeast Document Conservation Center and the Massachusetts Board of Library Commissioners. They're supposed to be releasing an updated version of the tool, and we're hoping, fingers crossed, sometime this year. And the Northeast Document Conservation Center created another tool for disaster planning, and that's their planning worksheet. So it's designed to help an institution collect information that can then be put into a disaster plan. So it contains many, but not all of the disaster plan elements that we've talked about here today. So it does include, it does not have places to include information about evacuation guidelines, locations of facility system shutoffs, or other sort of response relevant policies and procedures like that. but it is really helpful for collecting contact information, supply information, and information about your salvage priorities. So you might want to use this as a jumping off point and then augment it later with more procedures and instructions for what's not included in the worksheet. And then the Pocket Response Plan, or PREP, created by the Council of State Archivists, is a portable supplement to your disaster plan. So this is a one-sheet, double-sided template that can be filled out with crucial contact information for staff, emergency responders, utilities, vendors, and suppliers, all on one side, and it has an emergency checklist on the other side that details the actions that should be taken within the first 24 to 72 hours following a disaster. So this is specifically designed to be printed and folded in a way that fits in your pocket so it can always be on hand. So this is a great way to boil down the essential information of your complete disaster plan into something that you can always have on your person. So that if you walk into your library one morning and find an emergency waiting for you, you'll have the first immediate steps to take right in your pocket. And as promised, VACDaRN has a lot of resources available to you on our website. And I want to briefly introduce you to the website. So VACDaRN is concerned with emergency preparedness, not only for cultural heritage organizations like libraries, museums, and archives, but also for performing arts organizations and individual artists. So you can see on the top of this image that the website, well, it's actually a little small, so I'm sorry about that, but you can see on the top, the website's broken into areas based on the role or the type of organization that you are. So we have emergency managers, cultural heritage institutions, arts organizations, or artists. So within each type, there are lists of resources broken into 3 categories that reflect the emergency management cycle. So the readiness resources guide you through preparedness and mitigation actions that you can take to ready yourself before a disaster hits. The response section shares resources for what you should do in the immediate aftermath of an emergency in order to start your recovery process as soon as possible. And the recovery section shares tools that can help you bounce back after a disaster, including recovery funding, building restoration, collection salvage, and community healing. And much like a disaster plan itself, the VACDaRN resources and website as a whole is a living document. So as we learn about new tools, we add them. So be sure to check back often. So this is a quick look at what the readiness for cultural heritage institutions looks like. So we've arranged it in a way that is a general outline of the steps that you should take to prepare yourself for disasters. So from this page, you can access links to the Pocket Response Plan, D-Plan, and the Vermont Disaster Plan template that we walked through today. You can also take a look at the state's complete hazard mitigation plan that we looked at earlier if you're interested. And this is how the response and recovery sections are laid out on VACDaRN's site. So you will find out about many more national organizations and groups that have resources related to disaster planning and emergency preparedness, many, many more than I could cover today. But again, as we find out about other valuable resources and tools, we add them to the site, so it's always being updated. And the Vermont Historical Records Program is a resource for you. So we can help with site assessments and can work with you to draft disaster plans. And we are actually hoping that we might be able to gather a cohort of people who are interested in working on disaster plans together. So if that is interesting at all to you, do reach out to us. We'd be excited to help out. And do not underestimate the wealth of knowledge that your own peers bring to the table. So doubtless there are other libraries and cultural heritage institutions near you who have experienced some sort of emergency that they've had to recover from. So find out what their experience was like. What worked well? How would they have handled it differently? What did they learn? What sorts of relationships do they have with their local emergency responders and managers? They have wisdom to share and would probably love to share it. And here we are at the end. I've covered a lot of information today, from the basics of emergency management to the components of a disaster plan to general strategies to help you in your preparedness efforts. So there are a few things that I hope you remember and walk away with as you start on this process. First, Again, your plan is unique to your institution. Your plan won't look exactly like someone else's, and that's okay. Your plan may not exactly follow the templates you've seen here today, and that's also okay. Even the templates don't look exactly alike. What they're meant to be is a tool to guide you through the process of developing your own unique plan that works for you. And then keep things as simple as possible. Your plan does not have to be 50 pages long if you can cover everything you need to in 20. You want the plan to work for you when you need it to. And this goes for all of the other preparedness activities as well. If you don't want to take the time to find your own vendor, then jump on the Polygon bandwagon that the state has already set up. You don't need fancy supplies if you can find stuff that works for your cache around your house and your staff's houses. The more simple you keep things, the more likely that you'll stick with your emergency preparedness efforts and ensure that they work for your needs. Disaster plan writing and emergency preparedness actions in general are iterative. You don't do it once and you're done. You have to revisit the plan and make sure it's up to date, or it won't be useful. You have to make sure your supplies are still stocked, keep up those relationships with your local emergency responders, especially as they have any staff turnover. And it's actually a good thing that you have to continue to revisit these activities because it will continue to reinforce the emergency preparedness skills you have, which, of course, keeps you prepared. Absolutely set up as much as you can in advance, supply kits, standing contracts or agreements, relationships with emergency responders. Do it now so you don't have to think about it later when something's actually happening. Do it now while you're thinking about it and while you're developing your emergency plan. And remember, you are not alone in this. You don't have to and shouldn't have to develop this plan on your own. Each library and institution has a set of people who each have their own unique skill set that is useful in disaster planning and response. Emergency preparedness by its nature has to be collaborative because it involves so many skill sets and logistical moving parts. It's all about building connections and relationships with those moving parts and creating a community of emergency preparedness for your library. That's all I have for you today. I really hope that this was a helpful introduction to the world of emergency preparedness and disaster planning. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us at the VHRP if you have thoughts or questions after today. We just would love to help. So at this point, we have very little time for questions, but we've got a little bit of time. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sally. That was amazing. There was so much information. People that are still on the call, if you want to unmute yourselves and leap in with a verbal question, or you can put something in the chat. Let's see, it looks like maybe we getting great content from people. So you can now see the chat again, right, Sally? Are you?
I think so. I'm not still sharing, am I?
No. So far, no questions. I mean, I actually think it was so comprehensive that you covered pretty much every question I would have thought of. I do just want to clarify one thing, though. So the contract that the state has, like a library could use that service and then they would just pay for it themselves, but it would be at a reduced rate because of the contract the state has.
Yes.
But they would definitely have access to the service.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, the state, when they negotiated it, you know, they locked in a rate for everybody, but the state's not paying for it. You'd have to pay for that service yourself.
Okay. So anybody who is registered for this, I emailed Sally's handouts in advance to people who are registered, but if you were not, we will post them on our website as well. And if you can't find them there, just get in touch with me and I will send them to you. So it looks like we don't have questions and people might be hopping off to go to the Realm webinar. So thank you so much, Sally. And remember everyone, there's an intermediate workshop, similar topics, but a deeper dive next week at 2 o'clock next Thursday, the 22nd. I put a registration link in the chat, but it's also up on our website. So hope to see many of you then. And our presenter that day will be Rachel Onuf. So we're looking forward to that as well. Thank you again. And thank you to everyone for coming.
Thank you, everyone.